Everyone. I analyzed the article Venezuela's Political Crisis. Can Regional Actors Help? My name is Taylin Turner, by the way, and I conducted this analysis. This article was written by Andreas Feldman, Frederico Merck, and Oliver Stuncal for the Carnegie Endowment of International Peace, which is basically a democratic think tank promoting international democratization. The main purpose of this article, I found, was to question the effectiveness of regional actors, specifically in the Venezuelan crisis. They argue that first, the US and North American states are uninvolved and ineffective because of other pressing international issues, such as the Syrian crisis, North Korea, China, and other issues that they find to be bigger than the Venezuelan crisis. They also argue that the countries with the greatest ability for unilateral action in influencing and monitoring Venezuela and their instability is Brazil, Brazil, Chile, and Argentina. However, they argue that these countries are not in a position to have legitimate influence in Venezuela and are relatively ineffective. Furthermore, multilateral organizations have the greatest chance to influence democratization and stability within the country. However, they find that the groups are not consistent, they are weak, and they're not pushing for democracy like they should be. These groups include the Organization of American States and the United South American Nations, or the UNASUR, and the OAS. Ultimately, the authors conclude that the elections in 2015, so they're writing in earlier 2015, looking forward to the upcoming elections, they're arguing that these future elections will be most effective and ultimately the only way to change the effectiveness of regional actors. They attribute the national policy changes that are coming with the election as the best way to start pushing for democracy again. They basically consider the only solution to be, after watching the elections, for organizations in the region and surrounding countries to push sanctions and then to ensure the free and the fair elections that are a sign of a democratic government. Ultimately, I found that the authors make very vague recommendations, however, and they seem to have assumptions and biases that are spurring on their research. So first, they recommend sanctions in their conclusions. However, they fail to specify if they want broad sanctions across the board for what countries. What countries are supposed to sanction? The entire region or certain countries more than others? Is it just oil sanctions or agricultural sanctions? They didn't make that very clear and they left it a very blanket statement. Secondly, they recommended that the OAS and the UNASUR, as well as what they call the ABC countries, are supposed to monitor and make sure that there are free and fair elections. So this is a very good notion and a push towards democratic stability. However, they spend the entire article basically addressing why we have not been able to be effective in monitoring Venezuela. In fact, Venezuela, they specifically state, has a refusal to be monitored. So they do not offer any sort of solutions as to how these regional actors and organizations can get back in and actually monitor these elections in reality. Also, their recommendations reflect their assumptions and their bias. So specifically, they're writing the article for a think tank that supports a democratic peace. So obviously, they're very biased towards a very institutionalized democracy and a very Western notion of democracy, I feel, using that as a stabilizer. And they don't really consider what may happen if the regime becomes more authoritarian in the future after these elections, and how we can be pursuing stability, perhaps independent of democracy if it comes to that. They really propose only democratization as the only solution and the only way forward. They are also likely on the liberal side of party lines, as they seem to have a slightly critical view of the U.S. International relations. For example, kind of dissing them to have their minds on bigger issues and disregarding the Venezuelan crisis. Additionally, I felt that they also failed to consider other non-regional relationships in Venezuela. For example, could other world powers have a hand in Venezuelan politics and in the government? For example, China, Russia, Korea's, any world power out there could possibly be having communications and dialogue with Caracas that we probably should know about, as world powers influencing a regional actor could be a long-term security threat for the region and for the United States. They also did not address U.S. involvement like I thought they would. They really disregarded any sort of U.S. actions and relationships and moving that forward and wrote it off as ineffective almost. However, they did mention Cuba slightly, as that's changing our relationship with Venezuela. And I feel like they could have addressed our interactions with Cuba on a deeper level as well. They do touch on the fact that Cuba and Venezuela have had strong relations in the past, and it could be a possible gateway for the U.S. as we open up dialogue with Cuba to use Cuba as a third party communicator between us and Venezuela. Also, they fail to address how we can be involved in, for example, monitoring the elections and using sanctions. For example, should we try to work to stabilize the nation through oil trade negotiations, or through sanctioning oil further, or through some U.S. NGO work? So, for example, I felt like they were very set on just democratizing as a means of stability within Venezuela, and they missed a lot of other opportunities and a lot of other brainstorming, specifically like oil, economic trade, and a lot of other things that they could have touched on. So they have a very narrow lens and only a few possible solutions for solving this crisis within Venezuela. Thank you.